Seattle General's fourth floor smells of antiseptic and recycled air, the kind that never quite reaches the corners. Fluorescent lights hum their endless mechanical song above Elena Martinez as she moves through the 0600 shift with the kind of invisible competence that makes people forget you're in the room. Her scrubs are navy blue, hospital-issued, immaculate. Underneath, rope scar tissue wraps her left shoulder like a permanent reminder of something she will never say out loud. In her right scrub pocket, folded into a perfect triangle, sits a flag no bigger than her palm. The edges are worn soft from 6 years of carrying it. She touches it once every shift, never more, never less, the way other people check for their keys. Elena's gait favors her right leg with the faintest limp that most people attribute to a shift that's gone on too long. It isn't. It's muscle memory from a place called the Hindu Kush where half her team didn't leave. She walks through corridors like she's clearing hostile territory, scanning each room in segments, noting exits, identifying resources. The hospital corners she folds into sheets are perfect, military precision, the kind that belongs in a barracks, not a civilian medical floor. Her hands move through fur placements with the fluid efficiency of a surgical team that's worked together through 3 tours. Dr. Mercer barely glances at her name badge during morning rounds. He's already categorized her as another interchangeable floor nurse, the kind that follows protocols without question, the kind that disappears into the machinery of the hospital's careful operations. He's wrong about that. Room for 47 admits at 0800. The admission board reads Marcus Webb, 58, deaf since a roadside IED detonated 12 feet from his Humvee in 2009. Respiratory compromise, transferred from the Savannah VA, needs close monitoring and clear communication documentation. Elena's hand freezes on his chart for half a second, just half, before her face goes completely blank. She sets the clipboard down with the same precision she applies to everything else. Steady. The override is instantaneous. Professional. She moves into the room and her eyes land on his left forearm where the tattoo lives in faded military ink. Block letters. Capital letters. Martinez. The name stretches across his inner arm like an anchor, like a thing that meant something once, like a thing that meant everything. His eyes pass over her face without the slightest flicker of recognition. Nothing. The signature beneath the tattooed name and the date, 6 years ago, have erased whoever he remembers saving him. She brings his medications at 0900. Prednisone, albuterol, a beta blocker for his heart rate. She sets them on his bedside table with her movements economical and professional. His gaze doesn't focus on her. He's watching the television mounted on the wall across the room where a cooking show plays with captions running along the bottom. She doesn't expect recognition. She stopped expecting that a long time ago. The break room fills at 1100 when the morning shift overlaps with the afternoon crew change. Elena sits at the small round table near the refrigerator, her lunch organized in a clear plastic container, grilled chicken, brown rice, steamed broccoli, the kind of meal that tastes like discipline. Around her, other nurses peel off their protective gear, unwind stethoscopes from their necks, decompress into the particular exhaustion of caring for people you'll never see again. The room fills with the sound of rubber gloves snapping into trash cans and the refrigerator door opening and closing. Elena opens her container and takes a single bite of chicken. She chews it exactly 24 times. She has learned to count. She has learned to measure everything. The room empties in 2 minutes flat. Absolute exodus. One nurse, Sarah, who works the ICU, literally stands up mid-sentence and relocates to the hallway. Then Chen, who's been friendly for 3 weeks. Then Rodriguez, who leaves his own lunch on the table. It's coordinated. Practiced. Professional. Like they've rehearsed this exact sequence. Dr. Mercer stands in the doorway with his arms crossed and a satisfied expression that pulls his mouth into something close to a smile. He watches the nurses exit without saying a word. He doesn't need to. The message is delivered through physical space and social contract. Elena sits alone in the break room with 7 other chairs and a refrigerator that hums like an animal in pain. She takes another bite of chicken. She chews it exactly 24 times. She does not look at him. She does not acknowledge the performance. The silence in the room becomes dense, textured, the kind of silence that carries weight. At 12:30, she returns to the floor. At 1400, it happens again. The break room refills during the afternoon rotation and Elena enters with her afternoon snack, almonds, unsalted, measured in a small paper cup. 5 nurses sit around the table in various states of lunch break. Within 90 seconds, every single one stands up and exits to the hallway. This time Rodriguez speaks as he leaves. Not to Elena. To his colleague. He says, "It's better out there anyway." The hallway door closes. The hum of the refrigerator fills the space where conversation should be. Elena eats her almonds. She counts them. 42. She finishes them in 9 minutes. The third exodus happens at 16:45 during the shift change transition. This time there are only 3 nurses present when Elena sits down. All 3 leave within 2 minutes. One doesn't even grab her lunch. Just stands, gestures vaguely toward the hallway, and relocates. Dr. Mercer is positioned in the doorway again, leaning against the frame like a man who's won something. He doesn't look at Elena directly. He doesn't need to. The victory is complete. The isolation is total. She's been here before, not in a break room, but in other places where silence functions as a weapon and consensus becomes indistinguishable from punishment. She finishes her shift at 1900. She does not cry. She does not tremble. She does not make eye contact with Dr. Mercer as she passes him in the corridor near the medication dispensary. Her jaw tightens exactly once. It's so minute that nobody would notice unless they were trained to see the small ruptures in composure, the way certain muscles contract under duress. She notices it happens. She files it away. She moves forward. The flag in her scrub pocket weighs almost nothing. She touches it at 18:55, alone in the staff locker room where the fluorescent lights buzz like insects and her locker sits third from the left, combination 47/12/31, the date her team left the Phi base. The fabric is cotton, worn soft by 6 years of carrying. The colors are faded from repeated touching, the red almost pink, the white almost gray, the blue washed out to something between navy and black. She folds it once more, even though it's already folded. Old habit. Ritual. Her hands move with the precision of someone who's performed this same gesture 10,000 times. The triangle forms perfectly. She slips it back into her pocket where it rests against her heart like a stone, like a weight, like the only thing keeping her tethered to who she used to be before the helicopters left the mountains and command decided that Captain Elena Martinez needed to disappear entirely, needed to become nobody, needed to walk through the world as an interchangeable floor nurse who absorbs criticism without flinching and accepts isolation as the price of survival. She drives home in rain that hammers the windshield of her Honda Civic like applause or like something angry trying to get in. The wipers barely keep up. She lives in a studio apartment on the north side of Seattle, 12 blocks from Pike Place Market, 6 blocks from a bridge that spans the Sound. The apartment is clean. The furniture is minimal. There are no photographs on the walls. There is a single bookshelf with medical textbooks arranged in alphabetical order and 3 novels she hasn't opened in years. She sits on her bed at 20:45 and touches the flag again. She holds it for 23 minutes. She does not cry. The tears stayed in the Hindu Kush. The fear stayed in Kabul. Everything that might break her remained in the places where she learned that survival requires erasure, that staying alive means becoming someone you're not, that honor codes survive even when the people who live by them are supposed to vanish into databases that get scrubbed clean. At 2300, her phone buzzes. It's a message from Seattle General Scheduling System. You're assigned to room for 47 tomorrow, 0600 to 1900, patient Marcus Webb. She stares at the message for 47 seconds. She does not respond. She places the phone on her nightstand. She folds her hands on her chest. She stares at the ceiling where the shadows move like people she used to know. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that 20 other doctors would walk past room for 47 without stopping, that Marcus Webb would sit in that bed waiting for someone to understand what he needed to say, that the hospital's perfect billing protocols would continue uninterrupted because a folded flag in her pocket and a tattoo on a dead man's arm and a name she'd forgotten how to claim would be exactly enough to keep her silent, exactly enough to keep her invisible, exactly enough to ensure that no one would ever know who they were standing next to. The third written warning appeared on the unit board in the main corridor at 11:02 a.m. on a Thursday, typed on hospital letterhead and laminated for permanence. Elena read it while passing between rooms for 43 and 448, her eyes moving across the words with the same mechanical efficiency she applied to everything else. Elena Martinez, failure to follow chain of command. Persistent insubordination regarding clinical protocols. Third violation. The paper was positioned at eye level, deliberately placed so every staff member would see it during shift change. Around her, 2 nurses pretended not to notice. A resident from cardiology studied it openly, lips twitching. No one made eye contact with Elena as she pulled the pen from her pocket and initialed the form, her signature as controlled as a soldier's salute. The real reason sat in room for 47 where Marcus Webb lay in bed 3 with a chart that had grown thicker by 20 pages in 48 hours. She'd questioned it on Wednesday morning. The first CT scan had made sense, trauma protocol for a deaf veteran with respiratory complaints, establishing baseline. The second scan 4 hours later felt excessive but defensible. The third scan at midnight served no clinical purpose that Elena could articulate. By the fourth scan at 6 a.m. Thursday, the pattern had calcified into something undeniable. Each imaging study generated automatic specialist consultations. 90 seconds per consultation. Billable to Medicare at $847 per code. 5 scans in 2 days meant 5 consultations, which meant $4,235 in revenue that appeared legitimate only if you didn't examine the timestamps closely enough to see that Dr. Mercer himself had ordered them all, had performed none of them, and had billed as if each one required 20 minutes of physician expertise. Elena had raised her hand during morning rounds. Not aggressively. Not publicly. Just a quiet comment to Dr. Mercer as he reviewed Marcus's imaging. The latest CT doesn't show new findings. Yesterday's study was already conclusive. Dr. Mercer had smiled. That was the terrifying part. Not anger. Just a smile that suggested she'd made an error in judgment by existing. At 11:02 a.m., he dressed her down in room for 47 itself, his voice deliberately loud enough for Marcus's daughter and son to hear every word from the visitor chairs where they sat paralyzed, watching a physician systematically humiliate a floor nurse in front of a patient who couldn't hear any of it. Nurse Martinez, your unauthorized deviation from prescribed protocols represents exactly the kind of cowboy nursing that gets licenses revoked. Mercer's voice carried the smooth authority of a man who'd never been questioned successfully. When I write orders, I expect compliance. Not creative interpretation. Not second-guessing from someone with a 2-year degree. Elena had stood at the foot of the bed, her hands perfectly steady, her jaw registering nothing more than the faintest tension along the hinge. Marcus watched her with confused eyes, his daughter's face flushing red with second-hand embarrassment. Your job is to follow instructions. Not to question physicians who actually understand patient care. Mercer turned back to his chart with the finality of a verdict. Adjust that last imaging order to the next available time slot. And don't let me catch you interfering with my clinical decision-making again. She'd nodded once and left. The break room at 12:44 p.m. held for other nurses eating lunch. Elena carried her meal, leftover rice and beans in a plastic container, and chose the table by the window. She sat down. Within 30 seconds, the first nurse collected her food and stood. The second nurse followed. The third nurse waited for 30 more seconds, establishing plausible deniability, then relocated to the hallway. The fourth nurse, a woman named Shonda who'd actually spoken to Elena twice since Mercer began the campaign, simply made a face, not unkind, just apologetic, and carried her sandwich out without explanation. Elena ate her lunch watching the rain stripe the window. The hospital parking lot shimmered beneath the downpour, cars reflecting grey sky like chrome scars. She counted 12 minutes of solitude before finishing her meal. 12 minutes of being the only person in a room designed to hold people together. Dr. Mercer watched from the doorway for the last 2 minutes, arms crossed, his satisfaction so palpable that it arrived like another person entering the break room. By 2:06 p.m., he'd filed the incident report. By 2:11 p.m., it lived on the corridor board. By 3:15 p.m., Elena stood alone in the supply closet on the 3rd floor, her back against industrial shelving lined with sterile gauze packets and for tubing. She reached into her scrub pocket and found the folded flag, the fabric soft from 6 years of handling, from being pressed between her fingers on nights when the darkness felt deeper than physical absence. The flag had come from Kandahar province, from a phi base in the Hindu Kush where the mountains looked like broken teeth against the sky. She'd carried it out folded in a dead man's pack, had carried it through 6 years of hospital shifts and silence and invisibility, had carried it through every humiliation because carrying it was the only way to remember that someone else's sacrifice was bigger than her pride. She pressed her fingers against the fold lines and breathed. The other nurses had started calling her nurse knows better behind her back. Elena had overheard it once in the locker room, hadn't reacted, had simply changed out of her scrubs and driven home in silence. The nickname was a weapon designed to isolate. It was working exactly as intended. Thursday afternoon at 3:44 p.m. brought another public correction. Dr. Mercer orchestrated this one during shift change in front of 12 staff members, his voice carrying across the nurses' station like a radio broadcast. Some people believe that watching a few YouTube videos makes them clinicians. That reading a patient's chart somehow qualifies them to override orders from physicians. That's not nursing. That's operating outside your scope, and that's how people get hurt. He wasn't looking at Elena directly. He didn't need to. She stood at the medication cart, restocking 4 bags, her movements precise and mechanical. Her breathing remained steady. Her jaw didn't clench. Her hands didn't shake. She was an instrument responding to stimuli, nothing more. No anger, because anger would suggest she believed in the fight. No hurt, because hurt would require emotional involvement. Just the calm that came from having survived worse, from having already lost everything that mattered. Around her, the other nurses pretended to work. No one met her eyes. By evening, she documented that Marcus had been examined, assessed, or consulted by exactly 7 physicians, all of whom had found reasons to defer his care to someone else. 7 doctors in 14 hours. The 8th would arrive Friday morning, and he would cite communication barriers. The 9th would mention liability concerns. The 10th would simply never respond to Elena's pages. She didn't know yet that 20 physicians total would encounter Marcus's case over the next 12 hours. That Mercer was orchestrating a systematic rejection so complete, so perfectly insulated by policy and documentation, that Elena would eventually stand in room for 47 at 6 p.m. Friday night watching a man struggle to breathe, watching him reach for oxygen that wasn't coming fast enough, watching a hospital choose its billing protocols over his life. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was already happening, the slow construction of an impossible moment, one refusal at a time, one incident report at a time, with Elena at the center of it all, holding steady, holding silent, holding the folded flag against her ribs like a promise she'd made to a dead man about what kind of person she'd still be when she finally had nowhere left to hide. Thunder rolled across the city like artillery. Rain hammered the windows of Seattle General like applause for a performance only God could see. Friday morning came with the kind of silence that only intensive care units could manufacture, machines breathing for people who couldn't, monitors whispering their electrical prayers, and Elena moving through it all like someone who'd learned long ago that survival meant noticing everything and showing nothing. Marcus Webb's oxygen saturation had been drifting downward since midnight. 88% at 0400 hours. 85 at 0530. By 0615, it was hovering at 84, and the numbers on the pulse oximeter weren't lies, they were a countdown that only the trained eye could read. Elena read it. She read it the way she'd read Afghan terrain through a rifle scope, understanding the language of collapse before it announced itself to the room. His daughter sat in the vinyl chair beside his bed, fingers wrapped around his forearm near the tattoo. Martinez. Block letters in black ink, 6 years old, a name inscribed into his skin because it had meant the difference between breathing and not breathing in a phi base where the mountains touched the sky like accusations. Elena had watched him sleep for the first 4 hours of her shift, watched the shallow rise and fall of his chest, listened to the ventilator's mechanical rhythm pushing oxygen into lungs that wanted to fight it. The kind of patient who needed a doctor's eyes. The kind of patient who was about to become a problem that nobody wanted to solve. She picked up the phone at 0615 and paged Drive Mercer. Code yellow. Respiratory status declining. Request assessment. She used the proper terminology, the protocol language, the voice of someone who understood hierarchy and knew her place within it. She waited 7 minutes. No response. At 0625, she paged again. Same message. Same 7-minute silence that came back like an echo from an empty canyon. By 0700, she'd begun the systematic documentation that would become the chronicle of abandonment. She recorded each page, each timestamp, each moment when the hospital's physician roster simply decided that Marcus Webb's deteriorating oxygen saturation was somebody else's problem. Dr. Brennan from cardiology returned the page at 0710, listened to her report for 90 seconds, and offered a single sentence: communication barriers make this case complex. I'm reassigning to neurology. Neurology had nothing to do with his lungs. Both of them knew it. The transfer happened anyway. Dr. Hayes from neurology lasted 45 seconds before citing liability concerns. Deaf patients require special accommodations, he said, his voice carrying the kind of professional distance that meant he'd already made his decision before she'd finished speaking. I'm not equipped for that complexity. Elena wanted to tell him that Marcus's ears had nothing to do with his lungs, that oxygen saturation was a language everyone understood regardless of hearing, but she simply documented the call, noted the time, and moved to the next page. The pattern was systematic now, almost mathematical in its cruelty. Dr. Morrison from pulmonology, whose entire specialization was respiratory medicine, returned her page at 0745 and declined with the explanation that his schedule was overbooked. Too many complicated cases already, he said. Try internal medicine. Internal medicine bounced him to infectious disease. Infectious disease suggested oncology, which had absolutely no connection to anything Marcus needed but provided a clean excuse to pass the problem sideways to another name on the roster, another physician who could hide behind the hospital's labyrinth of specialties. By 0900, Elena had paged 12 doctors. 12 responses, 12 refusals. Each one wrapped in different language: liability, communication barriers, lack of expertise, schedule conflicts, patient complexity, but the message underneath was identical: not my problem. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic, and Marcus's oxygen saturation had dropped to 82%. His daughter noticed. She kept watching Elena's face, watching the monitor, watching the door for the doctor who would know what to do. Where's his doctor? She asked at 0915. Why isn't anyone coming? Elena kept her voice level. Still trying to locate the right specialist. It wasn't a lie. It was a truth carefully positioned to hide the deeper truth underneath it, that the hospital's entire apparatus had decided Marcus Webb was someone else's responsibility, a hot potato being passed through department after department, each hand releasing it before the burn became too much. Dr. Castellano from emergency medicine was number 14. He lasted 30 seconds before explaining that Marcus needed consistent care from someone already in his treatment plan. I don't manage long-term pulmonary cases, he said, and Elena could hear the relief in his voice, the freedom that came from being able to say no and have protocol back him up. Dr. Ramirez from surgery offered similar reasoning. Not a surgical candidate. Page his primary. His primary was Dr. Mercer, who hadn't answered a single page all morning. Elena could see Mercer now, watching her from the nurse's station, his arms crossed in a way that suggested he was enjoying this, enjoying the moment when protocol and compassion were positioned so far apart that someone had to choose between them. By 1100, it was 18 physicians. 18 refusals documented in her chart like archaeological evidence of a system that had decided a deaf veteran wasn't worth the paperwork. Elena's jaw moved through a series of clenches she could feel in her molars. Pain was information. This pain meant her autonomic nervous system was preparing for what her conscious mind already understood. The next decision wasn't going to be made by anyone wearing a white coat. Dr. Chen from Critical Care became number 19 at 11:45. "Pager respiratory specialist," he said. "Not my service line." The respiratory specialist, when Elena finally reached him at 1200, offered the clearest refusal of all: "I consult. I don't manage. He needs a primary physician with authorization to order my services." Which meant nobody would order those services because the primary physician had already decided Marcus Webb wasn't his problem anymore. 20. There was always a 20. Dr. Voss from Palliative Care took the final call at 13:15. She was kind about it, her voice carried genuine regret, but the message was exactly the same as all the others. "I handle end-of-life conversations," she said. "Not a respiratory crisis. You need someone from medicine." Elena's hands were perfectly still as she held the phone, but underneath her scrubs, her breathing had shifted into a pattern she recognized from the Hindu Kush, the calm that comes just before something irreversible happens. 20 physicians. 20 refusals. Each one documented with timestamps and quotes, a paper trail that would look very clear if anyone decided to read it. Elena hung up the phone and looked at Marcus through the open doorway of room 447. His oxygen saturation was now at 80%. His daughter was standing now, pacing, her phone pressed to her ear. Elena could hear fragments: "Where are the doctors, and why isn't anyone coming?" and the kind of desperation that families developed when they started understanding that hospitals were buildings made of protocol, not people made of compassion. The afternoon fractured into hours that felt like minutes. Elena continued her documentation, continued her rounds on other patients, continued moving through the hospital like someone who hadn't just watched an entire roster of physicians collectively decide that they wanted nothing to do with the problem in room 447. Dr. Mercer continued watching her from various locations throughout the floor, a predator with perfect patience, waiting for her to cross the line that would give him everything he needed to bury her. By 1900 hours, Marcus's oxygen saturation had dropped to 76%. His breathing was rapid now, shallow, the kind of gasping that came when a body was screaming for oxygen and the lungs couldn't deliver. His daughter's voice had stopped asking questions and started making demands. "Get someone in here," she said. "Get a doctor. Now." Elena had already called the rapid response team at 1845. They'd come and assessed and then disappeared back into the hallways because rapid response meant stabilization, and you couldn't stabilize someone without a physician order, and no physician was going to place that order because they'd all already said no. She stood in the medication room at 1935 and pulled supplies from the cabinet with movements that belonged in a trauma tent, not a civilian hospital floor. 14-gauge catheter. Antiseptic. Gloves. Tape. She knew exactly where the second intercostal space was, exactly where the midclavicular line bisected it, exactly what the hiss of escaping air sounded like when you released the pressure that was crushing a lung. She'd done this 47 times before, in conditions infinitely worse than Seattle General's carpeted hallways and temperature-controlled rooms. Walking toward room 447, she passed the nurse's station where Dr. Mercer stood watching her approach. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. He smiled. He shouldn't have. In that second, Elena understood that this was the moment he'd been engineering for days: the setup, the isolation, the systematic abandonment by every other physician on the hospital's roster. All of it had been positioning for this single moment when she would have to choose between protocol and a patient who was about to die, between following the chain of command and following the voice in her chest that had kept her alive in firefights and combat casualty situations. She didn't slow down. She didn't acknowledge him. She simply continued toward Marcus Webb, whose oxygen saturation was now at 74%, whose body was fighting for air it couldn't get, whose daughter was standing in the corner with both hands pressed against her mouth like she was trying to hold back the scream that was building in her chest. Elena entered room 447 at 1943 and closed the door behind her. The sound was quiet. Final. The kind of sound that separates before from after. "Marcus," she said, and his eyes moved toward her, still not registering, still not understanding that the woman he'd been looking for across 6 years was suddenly standing beside his bed with the posture and movement of someone who'd spent her entire adult life in situations exactly like this. "I need you to stay still. Your lung collapsed. I'm going to fix it." She didn't wait for response. She didn't need permission from anyone who wore a title or held a license. She palpated the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line, prepped the site with antiseptic in one fluid motion, and positioned the catheter against the thin skin that protected the space between his ribs. The puncture took less than a second. The hiss of escaping air followed immediately, not gentle, not slow, but violent and sudden and beautiful in the way that all necessary things are beautiful. The oxygen mask readings climbed. 76. 78. 81. 84. Each number another second of life, another heartbeat that wouldn't fail, another moment when the mathematics of survival suddenly shifted from inevitable death to something that looked almost like hope. Marcus gasped his first full breath at 1947, and his daughter collapsed into the chair beside him, her shoulders shaking with the kind of release that comes when the body finally stops preparing for a worst-case scenario it doesn't have to survive. "I'm going on break," Elena said quietly, peeling off her gloves. She didn't wait for a response. She walked out of room for 47 and into a hallway where everything was about to change, toward a future where the quiet nurse who nobody had bothered to notice would become someone very difficult to ignore. Marcus drew his first full breath at 1956 hours. His daughter gripped Elena's arm, tears streaming down her face, her fingers digging into the fabric of the scrub sleeve. The oxygen saturation monitor climbed steadily, 75, 82, 88, 92, each number a small miracle displayed in green digits. His eyes fluttered open. For the first time in 6 hours, there was air moving through his lungs without the sound of drowning underneath it. Elena stepped back from the bedside, her hands falling to her sides. She didn't speak. She never needed to. 3 minutes later, at 1959 hours, Dr. Mercer entered room for 47. He wasn't alone. 2 administrators flanked him like sentries, one carrying a manila folder that looked heavy with consequence. The door closed behind them with a soft hydraulic hiss. Elena was still standing near the vital signs monitor, checking the printed readout, her back to the door. She didn't turn around. She already knew what was coming. Some truths announce themselves before anyone speaks them aloud. "Nurse Martinez." Mercer's voice was sharp as a scalpel. "Step away from the patient." She stepped away. One measured movement. No hurry. No hesitation. Her face remained blank, the kind of blank that comes from having already survived worse things than this moment could deliver. Sarah Webb, Marcus's daughter, moved to block the doorway. She was still in her Marine Corps uniform, JG insignia on her collar, and her presence suddenly made the room feel smaller for everyone except Elena. "What's happening?" Sarah's voice carried the edge of someone trained in cross-examination. "We need to speak with the nurse alone," one of the administrators said, the woman's discomfort visible in the way she gripped her folder a little too tightly. The hallway outside room for 47 had begun to fill with staff. Word traveled fast on the 4th floor. Elena could hear the shuffle of movement beyond the door, the low murmur of voices, speculation, gossip, the sound of a professional execution already being broadcast in real time. Mercer gestured toward the door. "Let's continue this in my office." The corridor was silent as Elena walked past the nurse's station. Not the comfortable silence of a quiet shift. This was the silence of people watching someone walk the Green Mile. Faces turned away as she passed. The same faces that had sat with her during shift change just hours before, when she was still invisible, still safe in her obscurity. She'd learned long ago that loyalty in hospitals lasted exactly as long as your utility. The moment you became a liability, became the thing that made people uncomfortable, the moment you threatened the careful hierarchy that kept everyone in their assigned boxes, you became expendable. The administrator's office was on the 3rd floor. The elevator ride took 47 seconds. Elena counted them. She'd developed a habit of counting seconds during moments when the future felt like it was being rewritten without her permission. Mercer closed the office door behind them. He moved around the desk and stood behind it, his posture a masterclass in manufactured authority. The manila folder was opened, its contents spread across the desktop like evidence at a crime scene. 3 written warnings. 12 incident reports. A documentation trail that looked like a building being demolished floor by floor, each paper another load-bearing wall removed. You performed a medical procedure without physician supervision, Mercer began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Without standing orders. You performed needle decompression on a pneumothorax patient. That is practicing medicine without a license, and it violates every protocol we have at Seattle General. Elena's jaw didn't move. Her hands were steady. She'd once held a pressure dressing against a carotid artery while a helicopter rotor wash nearly knocked her sideways, blood soaking through for layers of gauze in 90 seconds while she kept her hands perfectly still. This was nothing. This was a man in a suit using words like ammunition, thinking that paperwork could destroy someone who'd already been destroyed and rebuilt twice. The patient is stable now, the female administrator said carefully. She was young, maybe mid-50s, and her eyes wouldn't quite meet Elena's. Perhaps we should consider. The outcome is irrelevant, Mercer cut her off, his voice sharp. She violated protocol. That's all that matters. She made a unilateral decision to override hospital hierarchy. This is gross insubordination, and it sets a dangerous precedent. Elena said nothing. Silence was a weapon she'd mastered years ago, in a place where words could get you killed just as easily as bullets could. She let Mercer's voice fill the space. Let him hear himself. Let the administrator hear him. Let the truth of what was actually happening, a man destroying someone for saving a life, become undeniable to anyone listening. The papers came out, one by one. The first warning, failure to follow chain of command. The second, questioning medical necessity of ordered procedures. The third, one she hadn't even known about yet, dated that very afternoon, unauthorized medical intervention, patient monitoring only, no hands-on procedures without physician authorization. These documents have been prepared for 3 days, the administrator said quietly, looking at the dates. Before the emergency. Mercer didn't acknowledge this. He produced a termination letter, already signed by hospital legal. The letterhead seemed to shimmer slightly under the fluorescent lights, the kind of letterhead that ended careers. Effective immediately, you are terminated for cause. Your employment is concluded. You'll surrender your badge, clear your locker, and you're banned from all patient care areas. Elena reached for the pen without being asked. She signed the acknowledgement in her steady handwriting, each letter formed with the precision of someone trained to maintain composure when the world was coming apart at the seams. Her signature looked like it belonged to someone in control. It was the most convincing lie she'd told in years. You have until 2300 hours tonight to retrieve your personal items, the female administrator said. Security will escort you. Mercer smiled. It was the smile of someone who'd just removed a threat to his carefully constructed world. Just a nurse, he said, almost to himself. Always just a nurse. Elena stood and walked toward the door. Neither Mercer nor the administrators moved to stop her. What would have been the point? She was already gone. The erasure had been completed. By tomorrow, someone else would be in her locker, someone else would take her rotation, and the 4th floor of Seattle General would move forward as if she'd never existed at all. At 2,300 hours, Elena stood alone in the hospital laundry room. The room smelled of industrial detergent and hot steam, a sharp chemical scent that somehow smelled like endings. The folding table was cold under her hands. Her scrubs lay in a neat pile, 3 sets, all blue, all regulation. She began to fold them. Each movement was controlled, deliberate. She creased the sleeves along the seams with the same precision she'd learned to fold a flag, the kind of folding that required your hands to remember what your mind was trying to forget. Her ID badge sat on the table beside her locker. Deactivated. No longer valid for entry. The magnetic strip had been erased that afternoon, a final amputation. She picked it up and placed it carefully on top of the folded scrubs. The photograph on it showed a woman who looked almost peaceful, almost invisible, the kind of person hospitals were designed around, necessary but forgettable, present but not quite real. Her locker was already empty. She'd been efficient about it. 1 coffee mug. 2 pairs of compression socks. A phone charger that had never quite worked properly. She'd carried these things as tokens of a life that was never supposed to exist, evidence of a shift supervisor named Elena Martinez who was kind to patients, who caught things other people missed, who somehow always knew what to do when systems failed. That person was gone now. That person had never really been real. She reached into her pocket and removed the folded flag. It was smaller than people expected flags to be, barely larger than her palm when compressed. The fabric had faded from the heat and dust and time, the colors muted to something between blue and gray, between remembering and forgetting. She'd carried it for 6 years, through 16,000 hours of hospital shifts, through 1,000 moments when she'd wanted to tell someone the truth about who she was and where she'd been. She'd never told anyone. The flag had belonged to Private James Holloway, who'd been 23 years old when an IED took him. She'd carried him across a field. She'd carried his best friend across the same field. She'd carried 3 other soldiers and then she'd gone back. That was when the bullets had found her, twice, once in the shoulder, once in the thigh, but she'd already retrieved Marcus Webb by then, and his daughter had been right, he'd been looking for her ever since. The army had erased her records to protect something, some classified operation that still couldn't be discussed, some mission that had gone sideways and required permanent obscurity to be salvaged. She'd accepted the erasure. She'd lived it. She'd become Elena Martinez, just another nurse, someone who didn't matter enough to talk about. She pressed the flag against her forehead once, as if it could transmit everything she needed to say to the person who'd carried it into battle with her. Then she folded it smaller and placed it back in her pocket. The laundry room was silent except for the distant hum of the ventilators somewhere above her. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with that particular frequency that made people want to leave. Elena finished folding her last set of scrubs. She stacked them precisely on the table. She didn't look back at the locker. There was nothing there worth seeing. The loading dock door opened without sound. The night air hit her face, cool and carrying the smell of the parking lot, asphalt and rain that had fallen earlier. She walked out at midnight exactly, the way someone might walk out of a room they'd never been in. Her badge was deactivated. Her locker was empty. Her scrubs were folded with flag protocol precision on a table that someone else would clear tomorrow. She was gone. Officially. Permanently. Finally. Or at least, that's what everyone would believe until Saturday morning at 0830 hours, when Marcus Webb opened his eyes fully awake and conscious, and his lips formed a single word, one that would change everything, that nobody who knew her as just a nurse had any business knowing at all. Marcus opened his eyes Saturday morning as the hospital board convened in the 3rd-floor conference room, and when Elena arrived to collect her final check, her badge already deactivated, her locker already emptied, 23 years of service condensed into a manila envelope, she heard him whisper a single word through the doorway of 447. Reaper. Just that. One syllable that carried the weight of a phi base in the Hindu Kush, a mission buried so deep that her name had been scrubbed from every database, every record, every official acknowledgement of the 12 soldiers she'd extracted under sustained enemy fire. The word hung in the hallway air like a confession neither of them had given permission to speak aloud. His daughter was already there, a Marine Corps lawyer named Sarah Webb with the same methodical eyes as her father, and she was holding a document that made Elena's chest go absolutely still. The citation. Captain Elena Martinez, for extraordinary heroism during combat operations resulting in the evacuation of 12 personnel under sustained enemy fire, with disregard for personal safety. Sarah's voice carried the cadence of courtroom testimony as she read the words that Elena had never mentioned, never displayed, never allowed anyone to see. The room went dead silent except for the ventilator's wheeze in the corner, that mechanical rhythm that had kept Marcus breathing through the night after she'd pushed that 14-gauge needle into his chest cavity and listened to the hiss of trapped air escaping, heard his oxygen saturation climb from 68 to 88 in 45 seconds. Dr. Mercer had not been invited to this room. He was downstairs at his office at 09 for 5 hours, hands shaking for the first time in his career as he watched the security camera feed on his computer, the one advantage of his position, access to every hallway, every room, and saw Marcus Webb sitting up in bed, lucid, breathing without difficulty, alive because Elena Martinez had defied him. Because she'd stepped into that room at 1947 hours on Friday night when all 20 physicians had found reasons to pass his case elsewhere. 20. The exact number mattered. 20 doctors who'd cited communication barriers, liability concerns, complex paperwork, physicians who'd simply never responded to pages while Mercer smiled and filed another incident report. The hospital corridor buzzed with staff sharing phone videos they'd recorded on their personal devices, the moment Marcus's eyes focused, the way he'd gripped his daughter's hand, the single word that had made her pause mid-sentence. The CEO was calling emergency meetings. The board chairman had convened a task force. Mercer could feel the current shifting, could sense the machinery of institutional protection beginning to slip, and so at 1030 hours he made his first mistake. He sat down at his desk and drafted a response, a memo stating that regardless of any military background, Elena Martinez's nursing credentials had been falsified, she'd still practiced beyond scope, the termination was justified, medically and legally defensible. He printed it and carried it to the board meeting at 1115 hours, walking into the conference room with the confidence of a man whose authority had never been questioned. The board chairman cut him off before he finished the first sentence. Dr. Mercer, we're less concerned with her scope of practice and far more concerned with why 20 physicians avoided treating this patient while you filed termination papers that are dated before the incident occurred. The words landed with the precision of a surgical strike. The papers weren't supposed to be dated before the incident. They were supposed to be filed after, justified by her actions. But Mercer had prepared them days earlier, predicting her heroism, counting on her desperation, planning her erasure before it became necessary. The board chairman leaned back in his chair, a man who'd run a hospital system for 22 years and recognized corruption the way a hunter recognizes the scent of blood in water. That's a discrepancy. By 1200 hours, Mercer was back in his office, and that's when he committed the fatal error, the moment that would end everything. He opened his personnel file system, accessed Elena's record through his administrative privileges, and began retroactively altering the documentation. He added fictional disciplinary incidents, fabricated complaints from previous shifts, changed timestamps, inserted backdated memos, created a paper trail suggesting she'd been a problem for months. He worked methodically, professionally, the way he'd altered patient billing codes and phantom specialist consultations for 6 years, believing that digital manipulation was the same as reality, that if the record said something happened, it had happened. He didn't know the FBI had been investigating Seattle General's billing irregularities for 8 months. He didn't know that every keystroke, every deletion, every timestamp alteration triggered automated alerts in a federal database. He didn't know that his clumsy forgery, changing document creation dates, inserting records with future update timestamps, adding signatures with impossible dating, had just provided the final piece of evidence a task force needed to move from investigation to indictment. At 1340 hours, 2 federal agents entered Seattle General Hospital with badges and warrant cards and the kind of calm that comes from having already assembled an airtight case. They moved through the corridors with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators, their footsteps echoing on the tile in a rhythm that made nurses turn and watch. The charges were Medicare fraud, billing for unnecessary CT scans. Marcus's 5th unnecessary scan had been ordered on Thursday, the 6th on Friday, each one generating revenue, padding statistics, triggering kickback payments from imaging centers. Phantom specialist consultations lasting 90 seconds billed as complex evaluations. Medication overcharges. Unnecessary procedures justified by fabricated patient conditions. The scheme had generated $40,000 monthly in unnecessary charges, all of it routed through Mercer's department, all of it traceable through email, altered patient records, financial transfers. And at the center of it all was Elena Martinez, a nurse who'd noticed the patterns, questioned the protocol, threatened to expose the fraud by virtue of her refusal to participate in it. Mercer had needed her terminated because she was the only person in the hospital asking why. The only person who couldn't be bought or intimidated into silence. At 1,600 hours exactly, 2 FBI agents walked Dr. Mercer out of Seattle General Hospital in handcuffs, his wrists cuffed in front of him, his expression shifting from fury to panic to the hollow blankness of a man watching his entire life collapse in real time. The news cameras captured everything: the physician who'd orchestrated 20 doctors to abandon their patient, who'd humiliated a decorated war hero in front of her family, who'd attempted to erase her from institutional memory, now doing a perp walk past the same nurse's station where he'd posted her disciplinary write-ups. The walk was maybe 40 meters. It might as well have been a mile. He passed the doors to room for 47, and Marcus Webb was visible through the window, signing justice over and over to his daughter, his hands moving with the kind of precision that comes from sign language's exact grammar. Seattle News ran the story at 1,700 hours, prominent physician arrested in Medicare fraud scheme, terminated decorated war hero. The station spliced together footage of Mercer being escorted to the federal vehicle with footage of Elena performing the needle decompression. Someone from security had captured it on a hallway camera, her hands moving with absolute confidence, her voice calling out the O2 readings, her competence so absolute that even without audio, even in grainy security footage, her authority was undeniable. 1 year later, Elena sat behind a desk in the Veterans Services wing of a VA hospital in Savannah, Georgia. Her nameplate read Captain Elena Martinez, Director of Veterans Services, and the folded flag from the Phi Base sat beside it, no longer hidden in a scrub pocket, no longer something she pressed against her chest in supply closets. The Pentagon had cleared her for limited public disclosure after Mercer's arrest made her identity a matter of public record anyway. Her office overlooked the patient gardens where veterans received care without bureaucratic barriers, without 20 physicians finding excuses to abandon them. On the walls behind her desk hung the Defense Superior Service Medal and 2 silver stars, the medals that had been locked in a safety deposit box for 6 years, the medals she'd never mentioned, never displayed, never allowed to define her. Below them was a photograph from Hindu Kush in 2016, 12 soldiers before the mission, 6 who came home. Marcus's name was listed on the memorial plaque she'd commissioned for the ones who didn't. The ceremony that morning had drawn 200 people. Marcus was there, walking without assistance now, moving through the world with the kind of steady purpose that comes from knowing who saved your life and finally being able to say her name aloud. Sarah Webb, Marcus's daughter, was now a military liaison to the VA, and during her closing remarks she'd said something that made the entire room go absolutely still. My father spent 6 years looking for the person who saved his life, not knowing she'd been ordered to disappear, that her reward for heroism was erasure. She honored that silence even when it cost her everything. She stayed invisible even while being publicly humiliated. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Marcus had handed Elena a photograph during the reception afterward. It showed Dr. Mercer in a classroom at Savannah Community College, teaching CPR fundamentals to bored teenagers for $14.50 an hour. His medical license was framed on the wall behind him, revoked, mounted as a reminder of what happens when power meets accountability. Federal prosecutors had given him a choice: 12 years in federal prison or a plea deal with permanent license revocation and restitution payments spread across 15 years. He'd chosen community college over incarceration. Every morning, Elena touched the folded flag before starting her rounds, remembering the price of both silence and speaking up, knowing she'd make the same choice again, understanding finally that heroism wasn't about recognition or medals or having your name spoken aloud. It was about showing up for the person everyone else abandoned. It was about pushing a needle into a chest cavity when 20 physicians had decided it wasn't their responsibility. It was about folding your hands and accepting discipline and moving with absolute precision through a world that wanted you invisible, until the moment when invisible finally meant something. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, subscribe and let us know your story in the comments below. Like this video if you believe the quietest people in the room are often the strongest. And subscribe to the channel for more stories about the heroes walking among us, the ones we pass every day without ever knowing what they've survived.